I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
We'll look at what the phrase moderate rebels really means. Plus,
more moderate rebels are now coming together to fight back.
Who are the truly moderate rebels, and they're not very good fighters, apparently.
Killing all of the moderate rebels or semi-moderate rebels.
Moderate rebels. Boy, can you help me out with that term? What the hell is a moderate rebel?
Yeah, well, and our...
Moderate
rebels.
You are listening to Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, and I'm here with Max Blumenthal. In the previous episode, we discussed the CIA program arming and training rebels in Syria, which greatly strengthened extremist groups, including al-Qaeda and ISIS, and fueled a horrific, bloody war that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. And we, of course, looked at how corporate media outlets mourned the end of the CIA program as a supposed tragedy, and how the U.S. empire and permanent war state prolonged this catastrophic war for years. Well, in this episode, we have the privilege of being joined by Gareth Porter, who is an award-winning investigative journalist, one of the best around today. And he will be sharing his reporting on Syria and just what the CIA has been doing for these years.
Gareth Porter is an independent investigative journalist and historian who's focused on U.S. wars and interventions in the Middle East since he ended the hiatus from his work between Vietnam and the post-9/11 era. Gareth has a PhD in Southeast Asian Studies and International Politics, and he was the winner of the Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism in 2012. Gareth's written 2 books, one on Vietnam and one on Iran, that look at the way U.S. interventionist policies shaped by the military and intelligence bureaucracies. I guess that's what you'd call the permanent war state, the national security state, or what's commonly known now as the deep state. And Gareth is in studio with us right now.
Gareth has just published several articles in The American Conservative that detail how the CIA program inside Syria led to the strengthening of extremist groups. And now we have the largest al-Qaeda affiliate in history inside Syria. In June, he published an article in The American Conservative titled How America Armed Terrorists in Syria. And then in July, he published another article, which we'll be talking about today, called How CIA and Allies Trapped Obama in the Syrian Arms Debacle. And in that July article, Gareth wrote, quote, "The net result of the program since late 2011 has been to provide arms to al-Qaeda terrorists and their jihadist and other extremist allies, which had rapidly come to dominate the military effort against the Assad regime." So Gareth, can you talk a little bit about your extensive reporting and research on this issue and explain what exactly the CIA was doing in Syria for all these years?
Well, the way I would summarize the effect of the CIA programs that began, there were 2 phases, 2 fundamental phases that I talk about in both of these pieces. The phase where the CIA was merely, I say merely, but of course it's extremely important, function that they served, which was to provide logistical support in bringing together, pulling these arms from the Libyan government stocks in Benghazi in 2011 and arranging through CIA front groups that were operating there to have them shipped to the war front in Syria. And this was, of course, then the beginning of the arming of Syrian rebels in their war against the Assad regime. And it did, in fact, result in the transformation of what had been just the very beginning of skirmishes between rebel groups and the Assad regime into what was rapidly becoming a conventional war in some ways. And the purpose, indeed, the purpose of the Sunni allies, who were the ones who were basically the allies in this effort to to arm the Syrian rebels. The purpose of it was indeed to build up armed groups that could ultimately overthrow the regime in Damascus by force. So it is important to understand that this, even though it was a logistical support program, it did in fact have the same effect as really direct involvement in the effort to build up a military force that could in fact overthrow the regime in Damascus. So that was the first part. The second part of it, and I'll go back and explain exactly how that worked, but the second part, just to sort of summarize the two phases, really began in 2012, in late 2012, when the director of the CIA, David Petraeus, supported by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, were pushing very hard to get Obama to agree to a CIA program that would actually directly send arms to the groups that the CIA itself selected for support. And they were pushing this very hard at a time when Obama was resisting.
And those were ostensibly the so-called moderate groups.
That's right. They were expecting that they would be able to identify a group of so-called moderate groups who were not directly involved in al-Nusra Front, the Syrian franchise of al-Qaeda, that they could then build up and train as well as arm. And now part of the rationale for that in this second phase was that the Sunni allies were actually supporting the wrong people. They were supporting Islamists. By late 2012, it was clear that the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Turks were basically supporting groups that were more closely associated with al-Qaeda in Syria than the United States was comfortable with. So Petraeus and Clinton were taking advantage of that by telling Obama that you've got to get into this conflict in a much more direct way and direct the CIA to carry out a program to identify the groups we'll support, arm them and train them so we can build up our own CIA army in Syria. And Obama, again, was resistant to that. But in 2013, just to complete this second phase of the storyline, the people who were trying to push Obama into a much more direct role in arming and as well as training the Syrian rebels were more successful. And the reason was that they took advantage of this whole red line issue, the issue of that Obama himself had publicly declared that any use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime in Syria would be a red line, would cross a red line, and it would change American policy dramatically.
Which meant direct regime change through bombing.
Well, that was not necessarily what he was thinking specifically, but definitely that was the potential danger of that red line. And of course, that was then the beginning of a series of political developments, an interaction between the bureaucrats in Washington, the Sunni allies, as well as European allies, the French and the British, and the leadership of the rebels, rebel groups. And I have to say that includes al-Qaeda as well as the non-jihadist groups. And the net result of that was, and I can go into this further explain exactly how it happened, that the combination, that alliance between the Sunni allies and the CIA, particularly in Washington, and John Kerry, as Secretary of State at that point, succeeded in trapping Obama in agreement, in getting him to agree to a direct CIA program for the first time. And that was because they got him to go along with the idea that there had been use of chemical weapons in Syria by the Assad regime. In March and April, particularly, March and April of 2013, the case was made by all of these players in combination, and they managed to manipulate Obama into agreeing that the chemical weapons had been used, and that was the fulcrum that they used to get him to agree then to the CIA program. So that, in a nutshell, is the two phases of this program of helping arm the CIA rebels.
It's a really good big picture of what exactly was happening inside the U.S. government. In the previous episode, we go into the timeline of the CIA program in Syria, and one of the things we addressed is this talking point that pervades the media and is echoed by politicians that the U.S. program to arm and train Syrian rebels did not begin until 2013. And opposition supporters raised this point to claim that U.S. support came much too late to actually win the war inside Syria. But your reporting shows, and in particular an article you wrote for Middle East Eye in December of 2016 titled Behind the Real U.S. Strategic Blunder in Syria, in your reporting you contacted a former Obama administration official who spoke on the condition of anonymity, but who told you that by August 2011, so this is just a few months into the beginning of the violent protests inside Syria, that Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and also Turkey, were pressuring the U.S. to provide anti-aircraft and anti-tank missiles. And the U.S. eventually did send anti-tank missiles.
You also mentioned that there was the rat line from Libya, which obviously ended with the Benghazi attack, the notorious Benghazi attack. Chris Stevens was in Benghazi. There was a CIA station near the consulate that apparently was handling these arms transfers through Turkey to the Syrian rebels prior to the official inception of the Arm and Equip program, which I think you put the timeline at that beginning in June 2013, but this is 2011. Hillary advisor actually in the New York Times referred to it as the bank shot, using this sports metaphor to describe what they intended to do, which is a bank shot after regime change in Libya into Syria. And then you cite October 2012 DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency report that shows, hundreds of sniper rifles, RPG rounds, and, rocket-propelled grenade launchers. A Croat shell company, which in May 2013, before Obama issues the first official shipment, before the 15,000 BGM TOW missiles, the big anti-tank missiles that are kind of shoulder mounted that really escalated the war. You already have rocket launchers, 50 caliber rifles coming in, fragmentation rounds. This has been well documented, but we don't see it in a lot of the reporting, and you kind of unearthed a lot of this. So what was happening before Obama's Arm and Equip program, and how did that escalate the war prior to when the official U.S. intervention was supposed to take place?
So if I understand, the question is really to go further into what was happening in 2011 and 2012, essentially.
Well, you have the pundits, saying that the amount of support to the rebels was not sufficient and that it came too late. And you've documented pretty clearly that there were massive arms shipments flowing into Syria as early as 2011 and all the way up until June 2013.
Right. And you've focused in on the argument that has been made by the proponents of arming selected groups in Syria. And I think you're correct that this whole argument that we didn't do enough soon enough is really fundamentally missing very significant realities in the situation. And the first reality that they're missing is that the Sunni allies were, as you put it correctly, arming as fast as they could, sending these arms with U.S. logistical support to the Syrian rebels. And they were sending arms to the people that they thought were the most militarily effective groups in 2012. even beginning late 2011. The whole point of their policy was they didn't care about the ideology. They didn't care how Islamist they were. They didn't care whether they were working towards a caliphate for Syria or not. What they cared about was their military effectiveness. So the Sunni allies, all three of them, the major Sunni allies that the United States was not just working with, but really responding to their demands for arming these groups, what they were doing was putting the arms into Syria where they felt it would make the biggest dent on the Assad regime. So to the extent that the United States was not, quote, doing enough, it was a reflection of the reality that the very groups that the Sunni allies wanted to have the arms go to, because they believed they were the most effective on the ground, were fundamentally incapable of bringing about a fundamental change in Syria.
You're talking about Jabhat al-Nusra, Nuruddin al-Zenki, Ahrar al-Sham. These are Islamist groups that are, Jabhat al-Nusra is the al-Qaeda affiliate. These are explicitly opposed to democracy. They want to impose kind of a Sunni chauvinist state.
Yeah, and on that note, what's also interesting is looking at some of the militias that were themselves created by U.S. proxies, such as Saudi Arabia, especially Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam. This is an explicitly Salafi extremist group that was created and entirely bankrolled by Saudi Arabia as a way supposedly to undermine the influence of Jabhat al-Nusra. And that is simply because Nusra had the baggage of being an al-Qaeda affiliate. So Saudi Arabia's idea was, well, it looks bad to directly arm al-Qaeda, so instead we'll create a group that shares al-Qaeda's same ideology but doesn't have that political baggage.
Right, and of course the same thing was happening in the north, where Ahrar al-Sham was a dominant in the sense of the group that the Turks and
Qatar,
Saudis, as well as Qataris, regarded as very promising, and therefore were doing their best to dump as many arms as fast as possible into Ahrar al-Sham. And of course, we know, it's well documented, that from the beginning, Ahrar al-Sham was closely coordinating with al-Qaeda and indeed sharing weapons with al-Qaeda. And so what was really happening in this period of 2012 was that the United States, in cooperation with the Saudis, Qataris, and Turks, was getting these weapons into Syria. They were being given to groups that were not al-Qaeda groups, but which were either cooperating directly with al-Nusra Front or were cooperating with the Ahrar al-Sham group. And in the process, they were sharing the weapons that were being they were being funded by the Saudis and logistically supported by the CIA. They were sharing them with either Ahrar al-Sham or directly with Nusra Front. So it was a process that was inevitably arming the jihadists. Whether it was deliberate or not is a separate question. I'm not suggesting that that was the deliberate intention of either the United States or necessarily in 2012 of the Sunni allies. But they were willing to have those consequences once they understood, which was very early in the game, they were willing to have those consequences continued because they thought that was the only way they could get rid of Assad.
Yeah, and Ben, you actually wrote about this a little bit, that one of the groups that the CIA was arming, who were anything but moderate, Nuruddin al-Zenki, who were actually profiled by Channel 4 in the UK as one of the moderate groups in one of the more embarrassing documentaries, one of many embarrassing documentaries on the Syrian war. This is the group that beheaded the 19-year-old Syrian fighter Abdullah Isa on camera. They've been identified in Amnesty International reports for torturing and kidnapping journalists and lawyers. And they also share a Salafi ideology, but they were cut off in 2015 after getting lots of BGM TOW missiles, the anti-tank missiles that really kept the war going. And then this year, they joined Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is, the rebranding of al-Qaeda in Syria, the rebranding of Jabhat al-Nusra. You could call it alt-Qaeda. They joined with a group, wonderful group of moderates called the Bin Laden Front. I mean, they're just straight up called the Bin Laden Front. And so the U.S. had a little bit of trouble in listing HTS as a terror organization. I think you wrote about this for the Gray Zone Project, right?
So what happened essentially is, in January 2017, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was formed, and that is a coalition led by rebranded al-Qaeda, which is known as Jabhat Fattah al-Sham. And Jabhat Fattah al-Sham is itself the new name used by Syrian al-Qaeda, which was previously called Jabhat al-Nusra. So I know a lot of these groups have similar names and it gets a bit confusing, but in July 2016, Jabhat al-Nusra formally broke ties with international al-Qaeda, although it did this with the consent of al-Qaeda's leadership. However, cosmetically, this was supposed to represent a new development. This was expressly to present itself as a more moderate group, given Jabhat Fattah al-Sham, rebranded al-Qaeda, essentially dominated the Syrian opposition, especially in Idlib, which is the last remaining rebel-held province. Then, in January of 2017, an attempt to further strengthen its control over the Syrian opposition, Jabhat Fattah al-Sham, rebranded Syrian al-Qaeda, formed a new coalition with several other groups known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And this was initially allied with Ahrar al-Sham, which is the other major competing rebel group. It's an extremist Salafi group, but it's not technically al-Qaeda. And Ahrar al-Sham later broke its alliance with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and they've been fighting since. I know this seems like a little academic, but the funny thing is, many people often lampoon revolutionary left-wing groups for having so many similar names. There's a famous scene in Monty Python where they say, oh, we're the People's Front of Judea, or no, we're the Judean People's Front, etc. But the point is, this isn't something limited just to the revolutionary left. When we look at groups from the polar opposite side of the spectrum, these far-right Islamist groups in Syria, there's a very similar phenomenon. But even though a group's name might sound similar to another group's name, and even though they might share very similar ideologies, they still could be mortal enemies and fighting each other at each other's throats. But anyway, I digress. In January 2017, when the second rebranding of Syrian al-Qaeda was done and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was formed, when they did that, it included several of these groups, including, as Max mentioned, Nuruddin Azinki, which had been vetted by the CIA and had been touted as a moderate group. And the U.S. originally said pretty explicitly that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is a terrorist group. Then the U.S. actually went back, this is the State Department, went back to press releases that it had published weeks before and rewrote what it had written originally and replaced the words Hayat Tahrir al-Sham with Jabhat al-Nusra. So what they did is they went, post facto changed their official policy and said that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as a coalition is not a recognized terrorist organization. Rather, the core of it, which is al-Qaeda, is a recognized terrorist organization. So what they were essentially saying is, the coalition which al-Qaeda leads and of which it is the majority, the coalition itself is not actually a terrorist group, but the majority of its constituency is. And that kind of political distinction is, of course, ridiculous, but legally it puts the U.S. in a different position because the U.S. recognizes openly that members of this al-Qaeda-led coalition have been armed by and trained by the U.S. So by distinguishing the majority of the membership from the larger group, the U.S. can at least pretend that it didn't arm al-Qaeda.
But it's a de facto admission that you caught when they went back and rewrote those press releases, that the U.S. had at least inadvertently armed al-Qaeda or directly armed its coalition partners. Pretty embarrassing stuff. And I want to talk about some of the other ways in which our national security state armed al-Qaeda in Syria. But Gareth, you talk about this as an example of the national security state forfeiting what its core mission is supposed to be. So explain your point there and how they got to this point, or have they been doing this for decades? Right.
Let me just first mention as a segue into that in 2012, 2013, and 2014, the Obama administration was clearly perfectly aware of what was going on, that these arms were, in fact, strengthening al-Qaeda in Syria, and that their clients, or their allies, I should say, client allies in the Middle East, all three of them were also quite well aware of what was going on. And there was some evidence that not everyone within the Obama administration was happy with this at all. And some people wanted to do something about it. They wanted some pushback against the Saudis, Qataris, and Turks for what they were doing, even though the CIA, of course, was very deeply involved in that. And so, for example, we know that there was a proposal from the NSC staff that the United States threaten to pull out a wing of F-16, I believe it was, from the al-Udeid air base in Qatar, in order to warn the Qataris against what they were doing, which was providing arms which were, in fact, going to al-Nusra Front. And this was quickly scotched by the Defense Department, which said, no, we can't do that. We're still negotiating with Qatar for the renewal of base rights at al-Udeid. So that didn't go anywhere, and nothing else happened. There was no other effort, or there was no effort at all, obviously, to use the leverage that is inherent in the U.S. military relationships with all three of those countries to say, stop this. And of course, the reason is because they were already in bed with them for reasons which transcended the problems that they were having with the policy. So I just wanted to make that point that there was a drama going on behind the scenes in the Obama administration during these years. So the point that I was talking about, that you just asked about, in terms of how what I call the permanent war state, which by which I mean the Pentagon, the armed services, the CIA, the NSA particularly, how they have betrayed the single clearest U.S. national interest, I would say national security interest in the Middle East, in this whole policy, which is the interest the United States has in making sure that al-Qaeda certainly does not grow stronger, and doing its best to try to weaken it in every way possible in the region and beyond, in the greater Middle East. How they've done this, of course, is precisely that they have continued this policy of arming the terrorists in Syria by this indirect route, but nevertheless quite effectively, and knowing that they were doing it for essentially the last 5 years. And so this raises, I think, a fundamental issue that has not been debated, has not been discussed in this country at all, which is the degree to which this national security state or permanent war state, it has become a permanent war state since the 9/11, how it has essentially become a mechanism that is exactly the opposite of national security. It is a mechanism that advances the interests of these bureaucracies. But those interests are precisely the opposite of the interests of the American people.
And it, of course, also serves the interests of the military-industrial complex, the arms manufacturers, the defense contractors.
Right, of course. And I'm prepared to argue, and I'm going to argue in my next book, that in fact the permanent war state now encompasses, it's a combination of the state bureaucracies and the contractor companies that are so closely allied with them that they are now actually carry out functions within both the Pentagon, the armed services, and the NSA and CIA. I mean, they are actually doing work that was once done by those bureaucracies.
Exactly. And the government has essentially outsourced its functions to for-profit corporations, which underscores how neoliberalism and the military-industrial complex really meet.
They've outsourced it, and they've done it in a way that's hardly even outsourcing. It's now sort of out/insourcing.
Well, give us an example.
Well, I mean, I would say that, all of the technologies that are used by the CIA and the NSA, particularly the NSA, of course, for their tracking of signals intelligence around the world, are huge investments on the part of private corporations, which are entertaining or enjoying the closest sort of relations with senior officials in the NSA. I mean, this is the first thing that comes to mind because it's such a notorious case study. And we know that the choice that was made in 2003, 2004, 1999, 2000, 2001 in NSA, to choose one technology that would have been much more effective in identifying the evidence of al-Qaeda presence in the United States, for example, at an earlier point than the technology that they did choose. That it was chosen because it was a consortium of major corporations who had big contracts with the NSA for years. And they couldn't bring themselves to choose something that had been developed within the NSA by a small group of people who didn't represent large investments. And therefore, I mean, this is the classic example of how, U.S. policy in the counterterrorism war, quote unquote, has been determined to an extremely important extent by the interests of these corporations, which begins to influence the decision-making of the top level of the people in the NSA and the CIA and the Pentagon by virtue of the fact that those people end up working in those corporations.
It's the culture of the revolving door, and you also see it at the colonnade of think tanks along K Street. I mean, you have the Atlantic Council. This is sort of the heart of promoting the Syrian proxy war, promoting the rebels. And you look at who their fellows are. It's a who's who of, it's like a grotesque gallery of anti-Russian and regime change in Syria characters. And who's funding them?
Their salaries are ultimately paid for by the U.S. government, large corporations.
NATO.
Exactly. And also foundations, such as the Osfari Foundation, which was founded by the British Syrian billionaire Ayman Osfari, who has bankrolled a lot of the Syrian opposition in the past few years.
But also Raytheon, which produces the BGM TOW missiles, which have really driven the escalation of the Syrian civil war, and I think extended it. This whole thing probably would have ended in 2012 or definitely 2013 if you hadn't seen heavy weapons enter the battlefield. And this really is also exacerbated the death toll. So Raytheon is funding the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council has, Michael Weiss and these figures promoting the war in Syria, and it all works very well. Then you have the Institute for the Study of War, which has given us Max Boot, one of the most charming figures in Washington. He's someone who was just demolished on Tucker Carlson. It was like the first time I enjoyed watching Fox probably ever. Max Boot has never met a war he didn't like. Liz O'Baggy, I don't know if you remember Liz O'Baggy from the Institute for the Study of War, who was the kind of 26-year-old fraudmeister who faked her PhD and was pumping up the idea of the moderate rebels, and was cited before Congress by John Kerry and John McCain as an expert on the Syrian rebels. And, it was ISW that's been producing, along with Charles Lister, who I guess is at the Middle East Institute now, which is, completely funded entirely by the Emiratis and the Qataris. But ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, and Lister have produced these lists of the moderate rebels. And it's fun to go back over the lists and see where they are now. It's kind of like going over lists of child actors. Like nothing good happened to them.
Right. And in my article in Alternate on the bin Laden front and the rise of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, dominating the Syrian opposition. This is the second rebranding of al-Qaeda. I detail how in the October 2015 so-called Syrian Opposition Guide, which was published by the Institute for the Study of War, this neocon think tank, it lists Nouraddin Azinki as a so-called power broker and as a group so-called independent of al-Qaeda. It also named the so-called moderate Islamist groups Liwa al-Haq and Jaish al-Sunnah as other groups that were supposedly, quote, separable from Jabhat al-Nusra. And of course, these are groups that later on joined the new al-Qaeda-led coalition.
Right, and you have those, like al-Zinki was on Lister's list, but one of the babies of Lizzo Baggy, and they have this new young woman, I think her name is Jennifer Caffarella, at Institute for the Study of War. It's really just funny that you have like millennials deciding who the CIA should arm in Syria, and that Syrian people have to pay the price for this insanity. But their baby was called Harakat Hazm, and they had a branch in Aleppo, I think. They were also present in Idlib, which is now the stronghold of al-Qaeda. Jabhat al-Nusra has just taken control of Arar al-Sham's last checkpoint there and basically controls the Syrian-Turkish border. And Harakat Hazm is no more. We published a piece by Lindsay Snell, who was one of the last Western journalists in Idlib, who documented and witnessed basically the death of Harakat Hazm. What happened was the CIA dumped a bunch of BGM tow missiles made by Raytheon, whose stocks are soaring, into this group. They couldn't fight as well as al-Nusra. They didn't have the ideology. They didn't have the determination. They lost. Half of their fighters joined al-Nusra, and al-Nusra cannibalized their weapons and starts showing up, as you documented, Ben, start showing up on the Syrian battlefield with those tow missiles. So that is another way that the U.S. has been arming al-Qaeda, is through the kind of cannibalization of these FSA factions, which were talked up in all of these think tanks in Washington that are funded by the weapons industry. And Gareth, I don't know if you want to weigh in there.
I was just simply going to add a third sort of chapter in the evolution of the policy of the Obama administration, and that was the part of it that happened starting in 2014 and into 2015. And the importance of this is that this was the period during which the Middle East Sunni allies of the United States basically embarked on a new adventure, a new aspect of their adventure, which was to work directly with al-Qaeda and Arar al-Sham to build this new military command in Idlib province with the explicit intention of taking over the province for essentially the jihadists and whoever else wanted to go along with them. But they knew they were going to depend on the jihadists and the extremist Salafists, if you will, the Arar al-Sham people, to carry the military campaign forward to capture this province. And they viewed this as the strategic turning point in the war. And of course, they were successful in this. The Americans went along with it explicitly in the spring of 2015. After the capture of Idlib, there was this big conclave in Washington between Obama and the heads of the GCC states. This was his opportunity to say, what's going on here? You can't do this. And instead, of course, he held hands with them and everybody was happy. So this really was set the seal on the Obama administration's essentially their commitment to a policy of taking a very high risk that the jihadists would continue to maintain their momentum and take power in Syria. And we know, and that was, by the way, when they began to use, right after Idlib was when they began to use the tow missiles in a very aggressive way and very effectively against the tanks of the Syrian army. And so it was because of that we know the Iranians and the Assad regime went to the Russians and said, you got to do something about this. And that's why there was a Russian intervention. It was precisely because of that development.
In fact, David Ignatius, the kind of unofficial CIA PR man who is a columnist at the Washington Post, when he lamented the end to the CIA program of arming and training rebels, he cited this in particular as one of the victories. He said it pushed Russia into intervening in the country.
Great Afghanistan-style victory, right?
Absolutely. Brzezinski just went to his grave still defending the CIA program in Afghanistan, in which the U.S. armed and trained the Mujahideen, who eventually became the Taliban and al-Qaeda.
Well, the point of arming and training those groups in Afghanistan was, it was the bear trap. It was to entice Russia or force Russia to directly intervene, to bring the Red Army in so they would be bled at their soft underbelly. And so apparently you did have radical elements in the national security state who thought that the same thing would happen in Syria by bringing in these tow missiles and letting the rebels have Idlib. From Idlib, you can move west towards the Alawite heartland and start threatening, and just towards the core cities, which are also Sunni majority cities in Syria, and really start threatening the civilian population with genocidal forces.
On the point of Afghanistan, really quickly, and the pundits who lamented the end to the arming and training program, in the Washington Post on July 23rd, a former Pentagon official named Michael Vickers, who had been Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and served in both the Bush and Obama administrations, he published a piece called "The Trump Administration Should Not Give Up on Removing Assad in Syria." And what's funny is, if you look at this guy's background, Michael Vickers, you see that he had previously been in the CIA, and he was a leader in the program to arm the Mujahideen. And in the Washington Post article, he cites Afghanistan as a model for what the U.S. did. So you have someone who was literally an architect of the program in Afghanistan that created the Taliban and al-Qaeda, today openly defending the CIA program in Syria, which empowered ISIS and al-Qaeda, using that historical example. These people are very well aware of what they did and what is happening, and they're openly defending it in op-eds in major newspapers.
Let's understand who's in Idlib. It's the largest franchise of al-Qaeda in history. The council of the city is partly controlled by Abdullah Muhaysini, this genocidal Saudi preacher who raised millions of dollars for the offensive of Jaish al-Fatah through his Jihad Callers Center from private financiers in Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. So this is not like, this is really a disturbing development. This is essentially a very similar you have groups operating under almost the same ideology as ISIS in Raqqa and Mosul, very close to core Syrian cities. So of course Russia was going to intervene, but it didn't work out the way that these elements had hoped. And we saw that take place in Aleppo. Russia was successful this time, along with the Syrian military and their allies. And they really, by extricating the rebels from eastern Aleppo, then you saw the green buses come and everybody's pining in Washington. Samantha Powers crying about this genocide, although she's produced no evidence since then that it was anything like Srebrenica, as she alleged in the UN. But the green buses come in and they take out all the fighters from eastern Aleppo. And where do they send them but Idlib, the heartland of al-Qaeda, which really told you who was in eastern Aleppo and who we were defending, and who we were crying for and declaring our solidarity for. And now Idlib is sort of a penal colony for al-Qaeda. It's sort of a human warehouse. As I mentioned earlier, last week, Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda franchise, took the last checkpoint from Arar al-Sham, and they're in full control of the Idlib province. I guess Ben and Gareth, where do you think things go from here? I think there were some developments at Arsal on the Lebanese-Syrian border where Hezbollah routed Jabhat al-Nusra, and I think that raises some interesting questions about what happens with Idlib and where the war goes next.
Yeah, look, I think this is a very important point to understand, that what we are witnessing right now in Washington among a lot of other dramatic things going on, is precisely this very sore loser reaction that we're getting from various parts of the permanent war state with regard to Syria, as well as their determination not to let go of any other part of their far-flung interests around the world. And particularly, I'm talking about Afghanistan on one hand and the policy toward Russia on the other. I mean, I think this is one part of a much broader array of maneuvers going on in Washington on the part of the people who were opposed to the Trump administration in the first place, of course, didn't regard this administration as representing their interests from the beginning, but who have put all of the pressure they could on the White House in order to try to prevent any backtracking from the programs that they wanted to continue, both in Syria and elsewhere. And so, really, that's why I think this decision that was announced to end the program of CIA arming and training in Syria is worth dwelling on. It's a very significant milestone because it does suggest that there is a possibility of denying the CIA and perhaps the Pentagon on certain issues, and something that should give heart to those who want to continue that process.
Let me ask you this. You open your piece, How America Armed Terrorists in Syria, by mentioning a bill or a resolution introduced by three-term Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, which would have cut off the covert and overt support for rebels in Syria. It was called the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, and it was the first time in Congress that someone had challenged U.S. policy towards the conflict in the Syrian civil war. You saw Tulsi Gabbard get absolutely pilloried by the Beltway press corps. She had broken the bipartisan consensus and actually forced a debate on a proxy war. And there's very seldom any debate on proxy war. They're funded through the black budget and the House Appropriations Committee. She just broke all the rules in Washington. How much do you think Gabbard's initiative contributed to Trump cutting off the rebels, or what other factors might there have been in this decision?
I don't know the answer to the question of Gabbard's influence on the decision. I don't know of anything that would indicate that it was her bill that played any key role in the decision. I think that it was much more the internal politics within the Trump administration, and particularly the fact that we know that Trump himself has been skeptical about getting involved beyond the fight against ISIS in Syria, as well, of course, as Bannon being very much opposed to that. I think that's really the key to this decision. And I think that's, so far that has been the source of the opposition to the continuation and expansion or escalation of the war in Afghanistan as well. So there is this dialectic going on between the White House, the president himself, and a key advisor, and the permanent war state. And I must say, it reminds me very much of the kind of conflict that I have described in some of my other writing, both in my book on Vietnam, which talked about how both JFK and LBJ were put under pressure by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and his National Security Advisor at that point, in both cases, in both JFK and LBJ cases, to either send troops to South Vietnam in the case of JFK, or to start the war against North Vietnam in the case of LBJ. And they both resisted to some extent. LBJ resisted longer, but finally gave in. And then there are other stories as well, but then you have Obama obviously opposing the escalation of the war in Afghanistan in 2009, and in the end, making a compromise again and getting stuck with the escalation, which didn't really come to an end. It only partially ended. So I think this is a familiar pattern. What we're seeing now is a familiar pattern. And it may be, in fact, that Trump, for whatever weird personal reasons or political reasons, is willing to put up more resistance to the permanent war state than Obama did.
I wouldn't put it that way necessarily. I mean, I think your analysis is spot on, but Trump is fine with certain wars, of course. And to emphasize that, I mean, the war in Yemen, he is ramping up pretty drastically, doing 600% more drone strikes and, really expanding the war on terror in other parts of the region, really escalating aggression against Iran. But when it comes to, of course, conflicts like Syria, where Trump, although he is incredibly ignorant and knows, nothing about these conflicts, he does recognize that the U.S. did empower ISIS and al-Qaeda in this country and in this horrific war, and he did push to end the CIA program doing that. But he's still fine with certain aspects of the permanent war state.
Right, and I couldn't agree anymore with your observation. And that, I think what that suggests very strongly is that what is needed here is a fundamental shift, not just a shift, but a fundamental change in U.S. policy in the Middle East, which is oriented towards ending these alliances with Sunni governments whose interests are sectarian or undemocratic, and clearly not in the interests of the American people. They are not aligned with the interests of the American people at all. They're exactly the opposite of the interests of the American people. And so we need to have a movement that picks up this theme of ending U.S. alliances and military presence in the Middle East, because it has been a dead loss to the interests of the American people for decades now. We need to turn back the clock to 1990. We can't do it in one fell swoop, but we need to have a series of moves here that move in that direction.
In the last few minutes, Gareth, I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about what you think might happen in the future in Syria. And of course, none of us knows exactly what will happen. It's speculation, but the war is far from over. And even though the CIA ostensibly is ending its program inside the country, the Pentagon is still very active. There are thousands of U.S. boots on the ground. What do you think may happen?
It's going to depend on, to a significant degree, on the international politics surrounding it, obviously, which means the willingness of the United States to stand up to Turkey, to make sure that Turkey does not continue its policy of essentially using Arar al-Sham and al-Nusra Front as negotiating chips for itself. And, of course, it also depends on the relationship between Turkey and Russia as well. So, essentially, I think what this is leading me to is to say that there has to be a tripartite degree of agreement, strategic agreement between the United States, Russia, and Turkey that is going to end the civil war. Maybe civil war is not the right word to use. I'm talking about the war between the outside armed forces in Syria trying to bring about regime change, and the Syrian regime supported by its allies outside as well. We have to have an agreement on the part of all three countries that are in a position to exert power over the results, that this is going to stop. And so far we haven't seen that. But that's really the only observation that I can make that would make any sense, going beyond the reality that so far, as you say, the war is not over, and it's not over because we still have interests here that are in play that see some value in having the war continue.
You actually heard Brent McGurk make some interesting comments at the Middle East Institute last week. McGurk is the envoy to the anti-ISIS coalition, the U.S. envoy, and he slammed Turkey for supplying thousands of pieces of small arms to al-Qaeda in Idlib. So this was an interesting cleavage. We haven't heard this kind of criticism before. It does show, does reflect the U.S. really pulling away from the anti-Assad rebels. But at the same time, you see McGurk marching around the towns with his little retinue, including with, generals from the Syrian Defense Forces, the majority Kurdish front for the YPG, walking around these towns outside Raqqa that have been cleared of ISIS. And these towns have basically remained cut off from the Syrian government. The U.S. is kind of it looks to be on some imperial mission in these towns to federalize Syria. It's using, it appears to me, ISIS as a means of retrenching control in eastern Syria, or one of the Turkish state media publications. Another example of a kind of political rift between the U.S. and Turkey, publishing the locations of U.S. bases in eastern Syria.
Yeah, that was the Anadolu Agency.
And Anadolu,
very big news outlet.
And it was scrubbed. I think the U.S. protested and it was scrubbed, but you can bring up the, you can go into the Wayback Machine and see where the bases are. But the U.S. has set up de facto bases inside Syria. And prior to the Syrian civil war, there were no U.S. bases. So this is clearly an opportunity for the U.S. They've established these little Alamos all over eastern Syria, and I don't know where this is going to lead, but it clearly dovetails with the rising hysteria that you see in the New York Times, or you see in a piece in BuzzFeed this week about Iranian domination of the region.
And that BuzzFeed piece, extensively quotes U.S. government officials and Israeli officials. I mean, this is the perspective of the U.S. government. But Max raised a really important point, and he also used a particular phrase about Alamos that the U.S. needs to defend. And that's actually a reference to Colin Cowell, who is, one of these people who's, an apparatchik of the U.S. security state, who played a very senior role in the Obama administration in Middle East policy. And Colin Cowell himself, who is by no means an anti-war stalwart, he criticized the policy that the U.S. is pursuing in especially southeast Syria. And he said the U.S. has set up an Alamo that it is now defending. And that's, of course, very euphemistic. I mean, for years, an imperial dream has been to divide up Syria. In fact, if you go back and you look, even before the invasion of Iraq, and you look, 7 countries in 5 years, Syria was always on the list for regime change, and a key idea for it was to compartmentalize the country and partition it into little sectarian enclaves. And while it looks like the Syrian government might be able to retake the majority of its Arab population, it's increasingly looking like the U.S. is going to support the creation of an independent Kurdistan. And in Iraq, Barzani, one of the Iraqi Kurdish leaders, has expressly called for independence from Iraq. So, of course, it's too soon to tell, but there are more and more signs indicating that not just Syria, but even potentially Iraq could be partitioned on sectarian lines.
Yeah, I mean, this whole U.S. involvement with the Kurds over ISIS, it's obviously one of those things that gets the United States into a long-term commitment that then becomes something else. I mean, it's a classic example. And indeed, I would suggest that maybe you could call these bases not Alamos, but Pleikus, as in Vietnam.
Great analogy.
As in the one of the bases that the U.S. had in central Vietnam, the Central Highlands, which was then hit by the Viet Cong, and which the U.S. military used as an excuse to start the bombing of North Vietnam. So again, I mean, I think that these are excuses to continue to escalate and ultimately, potentially, to get the United States directly into war.
And we've seen that take place already with some of the Shia militias who happen to come near these deconfliction zones, which are obviously aimed at fragmenting Shia populations in Iraq and Syria, and they were attacked by U.S. forces, and they were warned, and the Syrian government was warned, and Iran is warned. So, it does seem like we could be on the precipice of a more dangerous escalation here.
Yeah, and of course the role of Turkey is unclear. Turkey militarily intervened in 2016 without the consent of the Syrian government and has been carrying out airstrikes and sending tanks across the border in the north of the country. And of course, the Kurds vehemently oppose Turkey's intervention because Turkey's targeting them as well. And the U.S. welcomed in Turkey's intervention, but the U.S. is also supporting the Kurds, especially the SDF. So there are all these contradictions. And I do think that we should underscore this by stressing that, I really do feel sympathy and solidarity with the Kurds in their struggle. The Kurds have been oppressed for not just decades, but for centuries, especially by Turkey. And, it is in some ways, very empowering and great to see, Kurdish progressive forces, exerting this sense of national identity. But the problem is when you have international imperial powers, especially the U.S., which just in 1916, 101 years ago under Sykes-Picot, artificially carved up the region for their own colonial plunder. I mean, that's not a very positive sign. And while I certainly support the right to Kurdish self-determination and support them in their struggle against the systematic oppression they faced for years, at the same time, at the end of the day, working with the U.S., I think actually will likely, as it has several times in the past in Iraq and elsewhere, will lead to a betrayal. And I do feel that, even if the Kurds do end up getting some kind of autonomous region or something, they will likely be betrayed at some point.
Yeah, I agree. And there was actually a proposal that was floated to have the SDF basically return its weapons once Raqqa is taken. And just that kind of suggests there's going to be a massive betrayal on the horizon. Of course, they said no, and the Pentagon pulled back, but it tells you what their intentions really are. At this point, the SDF is a Pentagon proxy being used to partition Syria, to federalize Syria, to retrench U.S. imperial control. And so I would just suggest to those leftists who want to go, join Kurdish fighters in Syria that they should just go and join the Marines directly. I mean, what's the difference at this point? And I was sort of offended when I saw on some anarchist Twitter accounts these masked fighters in eastern Syria holding up a banner pledging solidarity with the LGBTQ community and saying that, declaring that queers are smashing fascism by defeating ISIS. This is just an obvious pinkwashing of an imperial project, and it really has nothing to do with any kind of solidarity that I'm familiar with. Of course, defeating ISIS is a noble goal, but you have to look at the long-term project here, and the long-term project is an obvious imperial machination, well in keeping, as you pointed out, Ben, with the Sykes-Picot project. Gareth, you were nodding your head when Ben kind of forecasted the betrayal of the Kurds.
Yes, of course, this is the historical record, and there's a very good reason for that, because inevitably the United States has relationships and interest in relationships with regional allies, and those regional allies always want to screw over the Kurds. So I think it's inevitable that that's going to happen. I don't see any other way around it.
And after all, as Henry Kissinger himself said, America has no permanent friends, only interests.
And I think that's a good place to leave it for Moderate Rebels. I'm Max Blumenthal with Ben Norton, and you've been hearing from independent journalist Gareth Porter.
Thanks for tuning in. For those who want to listen to our other future episodes, we are online at multiple places. The easiest way to find us is moderaterebelsradio.com. We're also on Twitter at Moderate Radio, and we're on Facebook as well. With the name Moderate Rebels, you can find us there and on the website. And thanks for listening. Also, for those who would be interested in helping to support this program and support the independent journalism we're doing, we have a Patreon account, which is just patreon.com/Moderate Rebels. And all of that information is easily available online. So thanks so much for listening, and we look forward to continuing this work in the future.